Work on the ultra-long-range Me-264 started before the war. The German Air Ministry, the RLM, went to Messerschmitt, and in 1937, a design team started work on a 4-engine airplane bigger than anything the company had built. Inside the company, the study carried the designation P-1061, and for its first 3 years, that is nearly all it was, a folder of drawings a small team returned to whenever the factory could spare them. What they wanted, above everything, was range, and the number was staggering for 1937, about 12,400 miles. It could also work as a long-range reconnaissance aircraft if the Luftwaffe needed one. The designers explored more than one route to that number. Alongside the 4-engine layout, they sketched a variant called P-1062, which had only 2 engines instead of 4. The point was fewer nacelles and less drag for the same power. Each one of those 2, though, was a Daimler-Benz DB606, a coupled unit made by bolting 2 DB601 inverted V12s together and gearing them to a single propeller shaft. It was the same brute force solution Heinkel had chosen for the HE-177, and it earned the same reputation for catching fire. In parallel, the firm was building the Me-261, conceived to carry the Olympic flame nonstop from Garmisch-Partenkirchen to Tokyo for the 1940 Summer Games. Those games were canceled, but the work gave Augsburg real experience in wrapping an airframe around nothing but fuel. There was commercial logic behind it, too. On August 10, 1938, a Lufthansa Focke-Wulf Condor named Brandenburg lifted off from Berlin-Staaken with Captain Alfred Henke in command and landed at Floyd Bennett Field in New York 24 hours and 56 minutes later, the first nonstop heavier-than-air crossing between the two cities. To the airline that was a proof of concept for transatlantic mail and passenger service. To the RLM, it was something else. That same summer, Göring complained out loud that he didn't have a single bomber that could fly to New York and back. With the outbreak of the Second World War, the RLM buried Messerschmitt in orders for Bf-109s and Bf-110s. Those were the airplanes the Luftwaffe needed that year, and a bomber for a war with America was not one of them. The long-range reconnaissance project got shelved. Then came the Amerikabomber program. The idea was exactly what it sounds like, a bomber that could reach the American mainland. Work on the Me-264 resumed under strict new requirements. Those requirements had been set down at the very end of 1940. On December 20th, Willy Messerschmitt briefed 3 senior designers, Wolfgang Daigle, Paul Conrad, and Waldemar Voigt, on what the machine would have to do: 12,400 miles of range. It had to work as a bomber and as an airliner. At least 11,000 pounds of bombs carried internally, with smaller weapons on pylons under the wings. And above all, an aerodynamically clean airframe, because across distances like that, every square foot of extra wetted area turns straight into fuel you won't have on the way home. In early 1941, the RLM ordered 6 prototypes under the new designation Me-264. It was all metal, with a clean oval fuselage and a twin tail. All the control surfaces were electrically actuated. Most of the fuel lived in the wings, with flaps and ailerons running along their trailing edge. Tricycle gear, with a single large wheel on each main leg. Underneath that smooth skin, the structure was unusually spare. The wing was built around a single main spar with one auxiliary spar behind it, and the loads were fed into the fuselage through that spar and a pair of reinforced bulkheads. It was shoulder-mounted, gently swept along the leading edge, tapered, and very long in proportion to its width. The high aspect ratio wing every serious long-range airplane ends up with because it gives the most lift for the least drag. The finished airframe was puttied and sanded over its entire surface, a level of attention normally reserved for air racers. The electrical actuation was more than a curiosity. The whole horizontal stabilizer carrying the twin fins and rudders could be trimmed electrically in flight, which mattered a lot on an aircraft whose center of gravity kept moving aft as tens of thousands of pounds of fuel drained out of the wings beneath it. The twin tail followed the same reasoning that produced it on the Ju-290 and the Lancaster. 2 shorter fins gave the necessary keel area without a single fin tall enough to hit the hangar doors, and kept the structure clear of a tail gunner's field of fire. The tricycle gear was a genuine oddity for a German aircraft of that size in that year, when almost everything heavy still sat on a tailwheel. It held the fuselage level on the ground, which made loading the bomb bay simpler, kept the pilots looking down a runway rather than up over a nose during the very long takeoff roll a heavy machine needed, and it made ground loops a lot less likely. As the situation on the front lines shifted, Erhard Milch, Göring's deputy, cut the number of Me-264 prototypes to just 3 in early 1942. In February, the ministry floated, handing the whole thing to Dornier. But Dornier's production capacity was already stretched to the limit. The proposal was dropped and the project stayed with Messerschmitt. Construction started at Neu-Offingen, near Ulm, back in 1941. The first prototype, the Me-264 V1, was finished in late 1942. On the plan as drawn, this bomber would carry nearly 4,000 pounds of bombs all the way to New York City. It would drop them from extremely high altitude above anything the Americans could put up at the time. To save weight and drag, engineers left the guns off completely. The airplane's defense was supposed to be altitude and nothing else. It is worth pausing on that 4,000-pound figure because the whole program lived or died by it. 4,000 pounds is roughly what a single B-17 hauled to Berlin on an ordinary day, and the 8th Air Force sent them in formations of hundreds. When RAF Bomber Command mounted its first 1,000-bomber raid against Cologne in May 1942, 868 bombers hit the city and dropped roughly 1,500 tons in about 90 minutes. 3 million pounds in an hour and a half. Set against that, one airplane showing up over Manhattan after a 20-hour crossing with 4,000 pounds in the bay wasn't a strategic weapon, it was a gesture. German planners understood this, which is why the program's advocates kept finding other reasons. The psychological effect on American opinion, the fighters and guns the United States would hold back for home defense, and the one argument that actually held up, the airplane's value as a set of eyes over the mid-Atlantic convoy routes, where the Luftwaffe was very nearly blind. To speed up testing, the V1 was fitted with 4 liquid-cooled junkers, Jumo 211J1 engines with the annular radiators off the Ju-88A4. Each one was good for 1,340 horsepower at takeoff and about 1,060 up at 20,000 feet. That was a compromise, and everyone involved knew it. The Jumo 211 was reliable, proven, and crucially available, complete with nacelle and radiator assemblies that could be lifted straight off the Ju-88 line. What it was not was powerful. The definitive Me-264 had always been drawn around considerably larger engines, and 4 Jumos gave the prototype barely enough to get a stripped airframe into the air, let alone the fully fueled machine on the drawing board. The V1 never once flew at anything approaching its design weight, which means every range and payload figure ever quoted for the type was a calculation rather than a measurement. The fuselage was divided into 3 main sections. The nose held the crew compartment, wrapped in glazing. The center section carried the bomb bay with a walkway through it, a rest area for the crew, and a passage to the rear. The tail section held an observation post, reached by a passage running the whole length of the airplane. The main gear retracted inward into the wing center section, and virtually every cubic foot of wing that wasn't structure was fuel. The self-sealing tanks held about 3,600 gallons with another 1,500 in unprotected auxiliary tanks. That glazing wrapped almost the entire forward end of the fuselage in frame panels, putting the pilots, the navigator, and the bombardier inside what amounted to a glass cone, because a crew searching empty ocean needs to see downward and sideways as much as forward. A run to the American coast and back would keep 8 men aloft for the better part of a day and a night, so the rest area carried bunks and a small galley with hot plates, and there was a toilet in the rear fuselage. On a flight that long, crew fatigue is a design limit just like metal fatigue. The fuel figures tell you what kind of machine this really was. Between the protected and auxiliary tanks, the wings held over 5,000 gallons, well over 30,000 pounds of gasoline. The design office worked to a maximum takeoff weight of around 123,000 pounds against an empty weight of roughly 46,600. More than half of everything that rolled down the runway was fuel. The bombs were what was left over after the tanks, the crew, the armor, and the structure had taken their share. And that is why an airplane spanning 141 feet could offer a bomb load. A twin-engine medium would beat over a short distance. The first flight took place in December 1942. The date was the 23rd, the place was Augsburg, and the man in the left seat was Karl Baur, head of Messerschmitt's flight test department. The aircraft wore the factory code RE+EN. Baur kept it airborne for 22 minutes. The flight passed without incident. The landing did not because the brakes failed and the machine ran off the end of the runway. What followed was less a test program than a 2-year argument with the airplane. On March 23, 1943, on somewhere around its 17th flight, the left main gear collapsed on touchdown at Lechfeld. The V-1 was out of action for 2 months and came back in May with the gear leg rebuilt, the JUMOS overhauled, and a new horizontal stabilizer fitted. Between May 22nd and June 5th, Baur flew it 6 more times, 12 hours and 16 minutes in the air altogether, and his reports came back with the same complaint every time. The stick forces and the rudder forces were brutally heavy. On a fighter, heavy controls cost you a turn. On an aircraft expected to be hand-flown across an ocean and back, that alone killed it. The wing loading was at the root of it. Fully loaded, the Me-264 worked out at about 73 pounds per square foot. A B-17 sat at about 39. Even the B-29, an airplane nobody called forgiving, came out around 69. The Me-264 was above the B-29, above the HE-277, and more than 50% above the Ju-390s. That bought poor climb, mediocre stability, and high takeoff and landing speeds on an airframe that had to stay flyable while carrying its own weight again in fuel. In August 1943, the JUMOS came out and 4 BMW 801 G2 radials of around 1,700 horsepower went in. The swap took 7 months. The V-1 did not fly again until March 1944. The V-1, though, was only ever a proof-of-concept testbed. Once the United States entered the war in December 1941, the Amerikabomber program became a top priority for the RLM's technical office. Now Messerschmitt had to fit real defensive guns and haul a much bigger bomb load. There was only one way to hit numbers like that. Add 2 more engines. Every major firm went after it. Focke-Wulf proposed the TA-400 based on the FW-300A Junkers put up its Ju-390. Messerschmitt prepared a 6-engine variant, the Me-264B. It had all been written down already. The Amerikabomber project plan was completed on April 27, 1942, and handed to Göring on May 12th. It ran 33 pages, and 10 copies were made, 6 distributed among Luftwaffe offices and 4 held in reserve. The surviving document was eventually found in the archives at Potsdam by the German historian Olaf Greuler. It compared the contenders by what each could actually put over an American target. The Me-264 was credited with the largest load, around 14,300 pounds. The Ju-390 was rated at 11,000 pounds. The HE-277 at 6,600. The plan also quietly conceded the central problem by proposing the Azores as a staging field, which is another way of saying none of them could comfortably do the job from Germany. A commission under Oberstleutnant Edgar Peterson, a lieutenant colonel, had already put the Me-264's real performance at roughly 90% of what Messerschmitt claimed, and on a 12,000-mile mission, 10% is not a rounding error. The Focke-Wulf entry deserves a moment on its own. The TA-400 was Kurt Tank's answer, a 6-engine machine built around the same BMW 801 radials, with 2 JUMO turbojets added later. It was designed by a mixed team of German and French engineers at a facility outside Paris, and at a gross weight of about 177,000 pounds, it was projected to fly 7,500 miles as a reconnaissance aircraft. It never got past a wind tunnel model. The HE-277 story was stranger still. It was an HE-177, rebuilt around 4 separate engines in individual nacelles, in place of the 2 coupled and famously flammable DB-606 units the original carried. Göring had banned Heinkel from working on a 4-engine 177, or even using the designation. So Heinkel went over his head to Hitler, got the decision reversed, and then went on calling the aircraft the HE-177B anyway as cover. In April 1944, the RLM ordered all work stopped. Not one was ever completed. In the end, the technical office went with the Ju-390 because it was mostly Ju-290 parts, and the Ju-290 was already in series production at the Bernburg plant. Messerschmitt, meanwhile, was told to turn the second and third Me-264 prototypes into long-range maritime patrol aircraft, which was the job the U-boat arm had been asking for all along. The logic was risk aversion, and by 1943 it was sound logic. The Ju-390 was barely a new airplane at all. They made it by plugging an extra pair of wing panels into an existing airframe and stretching the fuselage, and the first prototype was assembled at Dessau out of what had been a Ju-90. The second used a Ju-290 airframe. Jigs, tooling, and trained workers all existed already, and in a war economy running short of everything, that beat a clean sheet design needing its own factory. Junkers could promise airframes in months rather than years. The Ju-390 prototype flew on October 20th, 1943. The RLM ordered 26 more, and not one was completed before cancellation in mid-1944. And since this story refuses to die, the claim that a Ju-390 flew to within 12 miles of New York is not true. The aircraft credited with the flight never flew at all. All those changes pushed the V2 way back, even though its design differed very little from the first prototype. The official requirements from the technical office didn't arrive until March 1943, and they changed the engines. The Jumo 211s were out. In their place, 4 14-cylinder BMW 801D engines with GM1 boost. GM1 was nitrous oxide, officially Göring Mission 1, and the ground crews called it the ha-ha gear, laughing gas. Chilled liquid nitrous was sprayed into the supercharger intake while the fuel flow was increased to match, and because nitrous oxide carries its own oxygen, the engine could go on making power in air far too thin to support it otherwise. Crews switched it on above roughly 26,000 feet in 3 selectable steps. It was not free. The tanks, plumbing, and insulation were dead weight on every mission, and on most missions, they never turned it on. To protect the crew, the engines, and the gun positions, over 2,200 pounds of armor was planned. There was room built in for guns, cameras, and gear for dropping radio buoys and flares. In the end, they decided to finish the V2 without the guns and most of the special gear. Those were held over for the next prototype, the V3, which was meant to serve as the baseline for the production Me-264A. By late 1943, the V2 was finally ready for ground testing, but it never got the chance to fly. An Allied bombing raid wrecked it on the ground. Despite the loss, work on the next airframe, the V3, pushed ahead. Like the V2, it had extended wingtips that took the wingspan from 128 feet to 141. Its defensive armament included forward and rear dorsal turrets, the first with a 13mm MG-131 machine gun, the second with a 20mm MG-151 cannon. Another 13mm MG-131 went into the nose glazing. 2 more of the same in waist positions, and another 20mm MG-151 in a ventral gondola. Crew of 8. 3 automatic RB-5030 aerial cameras were installed in the aft end of the bomb bay, and the bay itself could hold up to 4,400 pounds of bombs. For maximum takeoff weights, there were drop-away extra wheels on the main gear, plus 6 rocket-assisted takeoff bottles at 2,200 pounds of thrust each. On paper, the production version was formidable. Messerschmitt quoted a top speed of around 340 miles an hour at 20,000 feet, rising to roughly 350 with the nitrous running, a ceiling of 26,000 feet, and a range of some 9,300 miles, at a cruise of only a little over 200 miles an hour. Load it with 6,600 pounds of bombs, and the range dropped to about 8,900 miles. Load it with 13,200, and it fell to 5,300. Every one of those figures came off a slide rule. At the same time, engineers were drawing other variants. They looked at layouts with 4 Jumo 213s and 4 BMW 801E or G engines. paired with two Jumo 004 turbojets. Other options had four BMW 801TG engines and two BMW 018 jets. The engineers at BMW even ran the numbers on a design with two BMW 028 turboprops. Then there was the six-engine version on DB603s. In the files, it was P1075, but Willy Messerschmitt lobbied hard to have it redesignated the ME364. By early 1944, Germany was out of the materials to build any of it. Production was dead. The program was canceled outright before the V3 could even be finished. By then, the competition had moved somewhere the ME264 could not follow. After Christmas 1944, the Horton brothers answered the same requirement with a flying wing, the HO-18 with six turbojets buried inside the wing and a mostly wooden structure, glued together with a sawdust and charcoal mix. On paper, it promised 530 miles an hour at better than 50,000 feet and a range approaching 6,800 miles. Göring approved it in February 1945. Construction was to begin that fall. The war ended first. The ME-264's own ending was drawn out and administrative. Hitler had promised his support for the maritime version as late as July 8, 1943. But by that fall, Milch wanted Messerschmitt's capacity for the ME-262 jet. On September 23, 1944, Grand Admiral Dönitz, the aircraft's last serious patron because of what it might have done for the U-boat war, agreed with Hitler that the work should end. The formal directive followed on October 18th. The first public mention of the ME-264 came in July 1944. An unidentified German radio station reported that the aircraft had been built to fly Hitler secretly to Japan if the July 20th plot had succeeded. There was a grain of truth buried in that. The last flyable prototype really had been pulled off the bomber program and handed to an outside firm for a job nobody was talking about, just not a flight to Japan. It went to a German company called Maschinen as a flying testbed for an experimental steam turbine. The reasoning was not as eccentric as it sounds. A steam plant does not care how thin the air is, so its output would hold up at altitude without superchargers or nitrous, and it would burn coal rather than the aviation gasoline Germany had all but run out of. Coal was the one fuel the country still had in quantity. The turbine was supposed to put out 6,000 horsepower at 6,000 RPM, more than all four Jumos had made together. It would turn a 17.5-foot propeller at 400 to 500 RPM or drive a 6.5-foot prop directly at 6,000. The installation called for 4 capillary tube boilers, a feed water pump driven by its own auxiliary turbine, a condenser, and the main turbine itself, a surprisingly small unit, only about 2 feet across and 6 feet long. The fuel was an unusual blend of 65% coal dust and 35% gasoline. A few components were built, but no complete unit was ever assembled. The V-1 was destroyed in an Allied bombing raid before the engine flight tests could begin. The date was July 18, 1944. By then, it was no longer a research aircraft in any meaningful sense. It had been handed to Transport Staffel 5 and was being flown as an enormously expensive transport. The raid caught it on the ground alongside the third prototype, still unfinished on its jigs, and destroyed both in the same few minutes. Sources do not entirely agree on where this happened. Most place the aircraft at Memmingen, struck by American bombers flying up from Italy in an attack that killed more than 150 Luftwaffe personnel and wrote off 30 aircraft or more. Others say Augsburg, and a few give a different date. What is not in dispute is that the only ME-264 ever to fly ended its life on the ground, under bombs delivered by the kind of strategic air force the Luftwaffe had never managed to build. Across roughly 19 months of intermittent testing, the V-1 flew fewer than 50 times. It never carried a bomb, it never mounted a gun, it never flew at its design weight, never flew with the engines it was designed for, and never came within 4,000 miles of the American coastline. Nothing of it survives. There is no airframe in any museum, no recovered section, no restored cockpit behind glass, only a handful of photographs taken at Augsburg and Lechfeld, a set of drawings and performance tables, and the paperwork of the men who argued over it. The idea outlived the aircraft. The B-36 flew in 1946, barely a year after the war's end, a genuine intercontinental bomber with 6 engines, a 230-foot wingspan, and the range to do from Texas what the Me-264 had only ever done on paper from Germany. The difference was never about aerodynamics or engineering talent. Germany had spent the 1930s building an air force to support armies over short distances, and could not go back and start again in the middle of a war it was already losing. The Me-264 was not a bad design. It was a carefully worked answer to a question Germany had chosen not to ask until far too late for the answer to matter.